bright orange notice flapped in the wind, slapped onto my boat like a public execution order. My heart pounded as I ripped it off, my hands shaking with fury. Violation. Notice. Unauthorized vehicle storage. Remove within 48 hours or face towing and fines. I had just gotten home from a long shift, looking forward to a weekend fishing trip with my son. Instead, I was greeted by a threat from none other than Catherine Langley, the power-hungry HOA president of Brookhaven Estates. I turned, staring at my beloved 24-foot fishing boat, parked in the exact same spot where it had been for the past 5 years, on my property. My grandfather's old compass still hung from the wheel, reflecting the setting sun. Then I heard it, the distinct click-clack of expensive heels on pavement. Catherine, dressed in her signature navy blazer, clipboard in hand, strutted down the street, surveying the neighborhood like she owned it. She spotted me holding the notice and immediately zeroed in. "Oh, good, you got my message," she chirped, flashing a smug smile. "That boat has to go. HOA bylaws prohibit recreational vehicles in plain sight." I clenched my jaw, my pulse steady. "This boat is on my land, Catherine, and I've got the documents to prove it." Her smile faltered for a split second. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. "Actually, the HOA just reassessed the property lines. That land? It's common ground now." Something wasn't right, and I was about to find out just how deep this scam went. I stared at Catherine Langley, my grip tightening on the violation notice. Reassessed property lines? That was impossible. I had surveyed this land myself when I moved into Brookhaven Estates 5 years ago. My property extended 15 feet beyond where she claimed it ended. My boat was legally parked just like it had always been. "Catherine," I said, my voice calm but firm, "this boat is on my private property. I have the original county records to prove it." Her smug expression barely faltered. "Well," she said, tapping her manicured nails against her clipboard, "I have updated plans that show otherwise. The HOA recently had all property lines reassessed, and according to these new documents," she gestured toward my boat, "this area is common ground now." Something was very wrong. Why hadn't I been notified about a property reassessment? Why was there no official county documentation on this? Before I could call out her bluff, a voice rang out from across the street. "That's funny, Catherine," called Linda Carter, my neighbor and a former county records officer. "I worked in the clerk's office for 30 years, and I don't recall seeing any new surveys filed for this neighborhood." Catherine's confident smirk disappeared instantly. Her fingers tensed around her clipboard, and for the first time I saw something flicker behind her cold blue eyes. Fear. "The paperwork is being processed," she said quickly. "Regardless, that boat needs to be gone by Friday." And just like that, she spun on her heel and click-clacked away down the street, but not before throwing a nervous glance at Linda. That's when I knew. This wasn't just about my boat. This was something bigger. That evening, I dug through my filing cabinet, pulling out every survey, deed, and document I had. I was going to fight this. But just as I was about to call Linda, my phone buzzed with a message from Derek, my next-door neighbor. "Derek, check your security cameras from last Tuesday. Catherine was measuring your property line at 2 a.m. with some guy I've never seen before." My stomach dropped. I pulled up the footage, and sure enough, there she was. Catherine Langley, in the dead of night, whispering and pointing, and the man with her? A suit-clad stranger taking notes and measuring distances. But what sent a cold chill down my spine was what happened next. Thinking they were out of camera range, Catherine discreetly handed the man a thick envelope, a bribe. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. This wasn't just about me. Catherine was redrawing property lines, and I was about to find out just how far this scam went. What would you do if an HOA tried to steal your land? Comment, expose them, if you think Catherine needs to be taken down, and don't miss what happens next. Because I just uncovered a secret that could take down the entire HOA. Like and subscribe to follow this wild HOA takedown. You won't believe what I find next. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting. The security footage played on loop. Catherine Langley, HOA president of Brookhaven Estates, standing in my yard at 2 in the morning, whispering to a mystery man in a suit. They weren't just inspecting my land, they were measuring it. And then came the part that made my blood run cold. Catherine slipping the man a thick envelope before they disappeared into the shadows. Bribery, fraud, property theft. I clenched my jaw. This wasn't just about my boat. She was stealing land from every homeowner in Brookhaven Estates. The next morning, I walked outside, my mind still racing with what I had seen. Across the street, Linda Carter stood on her porch, sipping her coffee. She lifted her chin at me. "You find anything?" she asked. I nodded. "Yeah, and it's worse than we thought." I pulled up the footage on my phone, and as Linda watched, her expression darkened. "That's not just any guy in a suit," she muttered. "That's Gregory Shaw. He's a private surveyor, and a dirty one at that." I narrowed my eyes. "You know him." Linda exhaled sharply. "I've seen his name pop up in some shady property disputes before. Every time a wealthy developer or HOA wants to adjust some lines, he's their go-to guy." A surge of anger shot through me. Catherine wasn't just making mistakes, she was paying someone to fabricate new property lines. "How do we stop this?" I asked. Linda gave me a knowing look. "We prove she's lying." That afternoon, I drove to the county records office, determined to find the truth. The clerk at the front desk, Mrs. Rodriguez, recognized me the moment I walked in. "If you're here about the Brookhaven estate surveys, I've already looked." I frowned. "And?" She gave me a tight smile. "No new property surveys have been filed in the last 10 years. I let out a slow breath. That meant Catherine's updated plans were completely fake. Mrs. Rodriguez leaned in slightly. "But there's something else," she said, lowering her voice. "I checked our flagged records, and last month, someone tried to submit altered property maps. But they got rejected for inconsistencies." I stiffened. "Who?" She grabbed a file, slid it across the counter, and tapped the signature line. Catherine Langley. She had tried to change the property lines through the county, failed, and then decided to do it herself illegally. I felt my fists clench. She thought she could get away with this. She thought no one would catch on. She was dead wrong. I took the file, thanking Mrs. Rodriguez before heading straight for my truck. Catherine had no idea what was coming. She had built her scheme on fraud and intimidation, but now I had the proof to tear it all down. I gripped the file tight in my hands as I drove back to Brookhaven Estates, my mind spinning. Catherine Langley had tried to file fake property lines with the county, and when that failed, she had forged her own. This wasn't just some power-hungry HOA stunt. This was fraud. And now, I had the proof. Back home, I spread the documents across my kitchen table. Official county records on one side, Catherine's fabricated blueprints on the other. The differences were glaring. The real maps, clear, consistent, legally recorded. Catherine's maps, measurements that didn't match, boundaries that didn't exist, and a fraudulent notary stamp from someone whose license had expired years ago. She had manufactured an entirely new set of property lines, claiming land that wasn't hers to take. Then, as I double-checked the dates, something else jumped out. The filing date on Catherine's fake map? A week before she had my boat ticketed. She had planned this. She knew exactly what she was doing. I exhaled, rubbing a hand over my face. If she had done this to my property, how many others had she targeted? I needed more evidence, and I knew exactly where to get it. That evening, I knocked on Derek's door. It took him a moment to open, and when he did, I saw the guilt written all over his face. He barely made eye contact. I held up my phone, pausing the screen on the security footage of Catherine and the surveyor in my yard. "You want to explain this?" I asked. Derek swallowed hard, eyes darting toward the street. "Look, man," he muttered, shifting uncomfortably. "I didn't want to be involved in this." "But you are," I said. "And now, you're going to tell me everything." He let out a shaky breath. "She's been doing this for months," he admitted, slowly redrawing property lines, claiming more and more land as common ground. I stiffened. "For what? More HOA control?" Derek hesitated. Then, he dropped the real bombshell. "She's been selling it," he said. "Bits and pieces of people's property, to developers, private buyers, even other HOAs. My stomach turned. That explained why she was so desperate to get my boat out of the way. She needed that strip of land for a deal she had already made. And it got worse. Derek ran a hand through his hair, looking exhausted. "She's got dirt on a lot of people," he muttered. "Threatened to report my pool house if I didn't play along. I didn't think it would go this far." I clenched my jaw. It's already gone too far. I turned to leave, but Derek grabbed my arm. "She won't go down easy," he warned. "She'll fight this." I smirked. "Let her." Because now, I had more than enough to bring her entire operation crashing down. I didn't sleep that night. The conversation with Derek played over in my head, each word cementing the reality of what I was dealing with. Catherine Langley wasn't just some overzealous HOA president enforcing ridiculous rules. She was a criminal. She had been redrawing property lines, illegally selling land, and threatening homeowners to keep them silent. And now, I had the evidence. By the time the sun rose, I had a plan. I grabbed my phone and started making calls. First, I called Linda Carter, the former records officer who had already poked holes in Catherine's fake property reassessments. "I need you to meet me at the county clerk's office," I said. "I have proof Catherine tried to file fake property maps." Linda didn't hesitate. "I'll be there." Next, I dialed Mrs. Rodriguez, the county clerk who had flagged Catherine's suspicious filings. When she picked up, I wasted no time. "You were right," I told her. "Catherine wasn't just redrawing property lines. She's been selling stolen land." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Bring everything you have," she said. "We'll get this sorted legally." I wasn't done yet. I pulled up the Brookhaven Estates HOA charter and started scanning the bylaws. Every HOA has loopholes, and I was looking for one I could use. And then, I found it. A clause stating that if a board member is found guilty of fraud, the entire board can be dissolved immediately. This wasn't just about taking Catherine down. This was about ending her entire regime. By mid-morning, I was standing in the county office with Linda, going through every official land survey Brookhaven Estates had on record, the real ones. Everything Catherine had submitted was either altered or completely fabricated. Mrs. Rodriguez took notes, her expression growing darker as she flipped through the fraudulent documents. "This is more than an HOA overstepping its boundaries," she murmured. "This is criminal land fraud." I placed my hands on the desk. "So what happens now?" She gave me a look of absolute certainty. "This goes to the county commissioner," she said. "And after that?" "The Attorney General's office." Finally, I thought. She's not getting away with this, but I wasn't done yet. Because while the legal system was setting up to dismantle Catherine's fraud, I had one last nail in the coffin to drive. The emergency HOA meeting was set for 7 p.m., but I was there an hour early. I wasn't coming alone. As I stepped into the Brookhaven Community Center, I saw the HOA board members already gathered, Catherine included. She was calm, composed, and completely unaware that her entire world was about to collapse. Her smugness made my blood boil. I took a seat at the back of the room, waiting. By 7:05, the room was packed. Homeowners were furious, demanding answers about fines, threats, and now, property lines. Catherine stood at the podium, pretending to be in control. "There's been a lot of misinformation," she said smoothly. "But I assure you, everything the HOA does is for the betterment of this community." I stood up. "Then maybe you'd like to explain these," I said, striding forward and slamming the real property maps onto the table. The room went dead silent. I could see Catherine's fingers tighten around the podium. "What is this?" she asked, her voice just a little too high. "This," I said, pointing to the official maps, "is the real layout of Brookhaven Estates." "And this?" I picked up her fraudulent documents. "Is what you tried to submit to the county." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Homeowners leaned in, comparing the two. Catherine laughed, but it was forced. "I don't know where you got those," she said, flipping her perfectly styled hair, "but our HOA plans are updated regularly." "By a surveyor you paid off?" I interrupted. Gasps rang through the room. I pulled out my phone, holding up the security footage of Catherine handing the man the envelope. The crowd exploded. "You bribed someone? You lied to us? Where's our money, Catherine?" Catherine went pale. Her mouth opened and closed, but she had no way to talk herself out of this. That's when Linda stepped forward. "I worked in property records for 30 years, she said, her voice loud and firm. "And let me tell you what happens when someone forges land documents." She held up a stack of papers. "They get investigated for land fraud," Catherine snapped. She slammed her hands on the podium, her face turning a deep shade of red. "You don't understand. I did what was necessary. If I had to cut some corners to keep this community in order, then so be it." The room erupted in outrage. At that moment, the doors burst open. County officials walked in, followed by uniformed officers. "Catherine Langley," one of them announced, "you're under investigation for fraudulent property filings and unlawful HOA enforcement." Panic flashed across her face. She turned to the board, expecting support, but they stepped away from her. Then Derek stood up. "I have more," he said. He walked to the front of the room and placed a flash drive onto the table. "This has every email, every document, and every illegal deal Catherine made." Catherine's legs buckled. She knew. It was over. The police escorted her out, still sputtering excuses. The homeowners immediately voted to dissolve the HOA board. By the next morning, the fraudulent property filings were revoked. And Catherine? She was done. Brookhaven Estates was finally free. By the time Catherine Langley was dragged out of the Brookhaven Community Center, the atmosphere inside had completely shifted. The once fearful homeowners, who had spent months, even years, walking on eggshells to avoid Catherine's outrageous fines and power trips, were now emboldened. Justice had been served, but the battle wasn't over yet. I stayed behind long after the meeting ended, watching as the remaining HOA board members hurriedly packed their things, avoiding eye contact with the residents now buzzing with anger. They knew what was coming next, a complete overhaul of the HOA, if not its total dissolution. Linda Carter approached me, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "You really did it," she said, exhaling slowly. "You took her down." I shook my head. "We took her down. But this mess isn't cleaned up yet." She nodded, pulling out a stack of HOA financial records she had been reviewing. "I've been digging into the accounts. You won't believe where a lot of the money went." I raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess. Straight into Catherine's pockets?" Linda scoffed. "Close. Turns out she wasn't just selling stolen land. She was funneling HOA funds into personal accounts. Not just hers either. Some of the board members were getting mysterious bonuses every few months." My jaw tightened. "So they were all in on it?" "Most of them, yeah," she confirmed. "At the very least, they knew and chose to look the other way." I scanned the room, my eyes landing on Derek, who still sat in the corner, hunched over with his head in his hands. He had been Catherine's reluctant accomplice, but tonight, he had chosen to come clean. That was more than I could say for the rest of them. "Do we have enough to file charges?" I asked. Linda smirked. "Oh, we have enough to burn the entire HOA to the ground." The next morning, I woke up to a neighborhood completely transformed. Where there was once fear, there was now determination. Homeowners gathered on sidewalks comparing property records, tearing down the ridiculous HOA rule signs that Catherine had enforced so strictly. Even Derek was outside talking with his wife. His face was drawn, but for the first time, he didn't look like a man carrying the weight of 1,000 secrets. Then I spotted the "for sale" sign being hammered into Catherine's front yard. I smirked. She didn't waste any time. A few minutes later, Linda called me. "You're going to want to see this," she said. I drove to the county records office where Mrs. Rodriguez was waiting for us with a folder full of documents. "This just came in," she said, sliding it over. "Catherine wasn't just dealing with our HOA, she's been consulting for other communities too." My stomach dropped. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. I flipped through the stack of documents Mrs. Rodriguez had just handed me, my heart pounding harder with every page. It wasn't just Brookhaven Estates. Catherine Langley had been pulling this scam in multiple communities, illegally redrawing property lines, selling off stolen land, funneling HOA money into private accounts, and pressuring homeowners into paying fabricated fees. But here's the kicker. She wasn't working alone. Buried deep in the records were emails, contracts, and financial transactions connecting her to several other HOA presidents across the state. My grip tightened around the papers. This wasn't just a corrupt HOA. This was an organized operation. I stepped outside, the sun casting long shadows over the once intimidating HOA headquarters. Homeowners were still celebrating Catherine's downfall, but I couldn't shake the weight in my chest. I spotted Linda, standing near Derek and a few others. They were already making plans, restructuring the HOA, ensuring this never happened again. I exhaled slowly, knowing my job here was done. But I wasn't done with Catherine Langley. 2 days later, her house sat empty. A sold sign plastered across the yard. She had skipped town, probably hoping to slither into another community and start over. Not this time. I dialed a number, waiting as the phone rang. "Detective Harris," a gruff voice answered. "It's me," I said, my voice steady. "I have evidence that Catherine Langley has been running HOA scams statewide. It's bigger than we thought." There was a pause. Then, "Bring it in." As I hung up, I looked at the neighborhood I'd fought to protect, the place Catherine had tried to steal from under us. She thought she'd won by skipping town. She had no idea I was coming for her.